Hi guys, it's Mrs. Sloan, and this is your first video for AP Biology, Chapter 1 of View of Life. I want you to know, let me put this in presentation mode. I want you to know that the notes that accompany this presentation are going to be down in the video description. And so what you want to do is just make a copy of those notes, all right? And when you do that, you will see that my notes are in a 2-column form. So column 1 is the scaffolding for the presentation, and you will see that there are little yellow highlight areas. That's where you want to listen attentively to what I'm saying right now and fill those notes in. So what I suggest is just that you highlight the yellow part and type in what we're discussing here. The second column is blank. That's so you can add any other supportive materials, a review that you have, quizzes that you want to link to, or another picture or diagram you find on the internet. And in my classroom, if we were face-to-face, we would work on these collaboratively, even if you weren't face-to-face, maybe with a couple other friends, working on the notes together, and building a really good resource as you prepare. All right, so I'm going to break this particular presentation of Chapter 1 into an overview of what life is, very brief, and then the 4 big ideas for AP Bio, and then I'll create a second video addressing the science practices scientific method. All right, so here we go. Need to move myself up here just a little bit. There we go. So biology is the scientific study of life. And if you look at your notes, you already have that. The next part are the characteristics of life. What would we look for to tell if something was a living thing? So I have left these a little bit blank for you here, but I'm going to teach you a little mnemonic so you will always know, a little song actually, always know the characteristics of life, all right? And then you can fill those in your notes. But first, why don't you do this with me? I'm going to back up a little bit so you can see. All right, sorry, summer, I'm in shorts. Here we go. To remember the characteristics of life, do these little hand motions with me. Living things are organized, made of cells. So all living things have cells in them. When I say living things are organized, I'm just pretending I'm looking through file folders, if you know what those are, okay? So living things are organized, made of cells. They acquire materials and energy. They maintain homeostasis. You can kind of think of this as like you had a meal high in sugar, so your blood sugar level rises, you have some insulin, you bring it back down, or you can think about temperature, sweating and versus shivering to maintain homeostasis. We'll have all kinds of discussions about that, okay? They maintain homeostasis. Another characteristics is they respond to stimuli. So it could be toward or away from light or food, danger, okay? So from the top, living things are organized, made of cells. They acquire materials and energy. They maintain homeostasis. They respond to stimuli and reproduce. They grow and develop. And they adapt. So these are like birds' wings adaptations. They adapt and die. Okay? One more time. Living things are organized, made of cells. They acquire materials and energy. They maintain homeostasis. They respond to stimuli and reproduce. They grow and develop, and they adapt and die. So you want to fill those in your notes, okay? I think you got that. If you need to, pause the video for a second so you can put those in your notes, okay? And I'm going to be right down here small again. All right, let's go on to the next part. This is a summary of the 4 big ideas. If you look at your notes, I have already summarized these. Now, what I want you to remember is these do not stand alone. They are woven together, these 4 big ideas, again and again. So we can look at something like looking at the process of glycolysis, which is the first step in cellular respiration. So that could, let me get a pointer right here, that could be referring to big idea too about how we utilize energy, but we can also talk about evolution when we talk about that, because all cells are doing that first reaction of metabolism called glycolysis. And so that's a universal reaction, and it points to a common ancestor. All right. So we're going to weave all of these concepts together as we go through. And really, when that starts to happen is once you have a few of these big topics and chapters and you're understanding them, then you won't see them as isolated chapters or units. You'll start to bring them into this bigger 4 big ideas for AP. All right. And I spelled those out for you in your notes. And then we're going to go through them quickly right now. So the first big idea is evolution. Don't stress out when you see the word evolution, and all evolution means is change over time, right? Things change over time. For instance, I have gray hair now. I didn't used to have gray hair. So summer changes it to blonde. Summer is my hairdresser, not the season. So when we talk about biological evolution, these are organisms maybe changing over time. So I'll walk you through that when we get into our evolution unit. But let me bring you the first point I want to talk about is that what points towards evolution, and we'll get into many pieces of evidence for evolution, but one is that life shares all these same molecules and reactions. For instance, what you're seeing here on the left, these are the 4 important organic molecules that help build all cells. So we're going to be talking about the monomers and polymers for those. Mono means one. So for instance, the first important organic molecule that you see here at the top are proteins. Well, proteins are built out of the monomer of amino acids, and we'll be learning all about that. Then you can see nucleic acids like DNA, RNA, ATP. You can see carbohydrates, and the monomer is always a sugar. And then we'll look at lipids. And there's 2 categories there, fats and steroids. And then besides having the same molecules, life shares common reactions. And so we're going to look at metabolism and those different reactions and in a different time, not this particular presentation. So on your notes, you have that part already filled in. If you're looking at the notes, what do all organisms share? The same basic characteristics, organized in the same manner, sharing genes and things like that. Okay, so this points to a universal ancestor. So they call this Luca, the last universal common ancestor that gave rise to all these different forms of life. And there may be more than one Luca out there, but just the similarity in how we store information, how we transfer information, our metabolic reaction, the universalness of that points to Luca. So on your notes, you have the unity of life suggests that all organisms are descended from a common ancestor. So that's what you want to put there, a common ancestor. The first cell or cells, and we talk about Luca, which means the last universal common ancestor that all life would have shared. Okay, could be more than one Luca. So next slide. All right, so let's talk about evolution. Evolution is just change over time. Like for instance, if you've ever been to, let's say you've been hiking and you find fossils of seashells. Well, if you're up on a mountain, what does it tell you about that mountain? That mountain was not always dry like it is now, but was covered with water. So that's just geologic evolution, right? Earthquakes kind of point to that, right? When the earth is shaking up, the earth is changing a little bit. You got some convection currents going on. And so that's going to cause geologic evolution. So evolution is change over time. When we talk about biology, on your notes there, what you want to fill in, common descent with modification. So descent with modification. Now, one of the mechanisms for evolution, probably its greatest contribution, there are several contributors to biological evolution, but one major mechanism here we're going to go with is natural selection. So what do you hear in natural selection? I hear nature, exactly. So nature is selecting what traits, what adaptations are best suited for that environment. So yes, this is a comic over here to the left, but if you're living in the desert, right, probably you don't want to have globs and globs of fat. That's going to overheat you. It's going to be hard for you to maintain homeostasis. So a different adaptation, like the ability to conserve water, that would be an adaptation that is selected for. So that's what natural selection is referring to. So these organisms can, when you talk about evolution, you're not talking about a single organism. So Joe the polar bear here can't evolve. It would be a population of organisms whose certain traits would be selected for over time. And we put a pin in that. We're going to have a whole big discussion about that at a later time. So you have the definition of natural selection in your notes. Adaptations, the part I need to help you with, is modifications that make organisms better able to function in a particular environment. And I gave you some examples there as well. All right, 2 big ideas down. Let's move on to big idea. Oh, whoa, there's another picture. You could look at that and say, what kind of adaptations do they have? Okay, so let's move on to big idea 2. And this is about energy and molecular building blocks. All right, so the first picture I have here is the ultimate source of all energy, right, is the sun. Exactly. And energy, by definition, is the capacity to do work. Useful energy is the capacity to do work. And another term we want to know is metabolism. And metabolism is all the chemical or all the enzyme mediated reactions that occur in your cell is referring to your metabolism. So when we think about this, right, ultimately the energy comes from the sun. Where do we get our energy from, right? I can't step outside and, I feel full. No, my energy comes from food. So I have to consume that food. I break down the food in through digestion and absorption, and I absorb those nutrients. I can use those nutrients in my cells. And I know you know what the powerhouse of the cell is. Yeah, mitochondria, right? So the powerhouse of the cell, I'm going to generate ATP to keep those reactions that require energy going, right, in my body. And we'll talk about that. Okay, and if you look at this, take a moment to look at this diagram. There are blue arrows, there are red arrows, right? So what you want to remember about this is that energy flows. Okay, energy flows and nutrients cycle. Energy flows and nutrients cycle. So we have a finite amount of nutrients, unless like a meteor or something brings them to our planet. We have a finite amount of nutrients here. And so we're going to use them to build living organisms, right, as you grow and develop. And then they get broken down, right, by decomposers and used once again. Energy, it's going to come in via the sun, right, ultimately, and it can move through different living organisms like plants, right, because they have the ability through photosynthesis to capture that energy, and then we can either eat plants or eat animals who have eaten that plant in order to get that energy in us. So on your notes, you already have energy, you have metabolism, and underneath chemical cycling versus energy flow, chemicals move through living organisms and are broken back down to inorganic molecules, whereas energy, starting from the sun, flows through organisms and eventually dissipates as heat. All right. Next on talking, here we go, homeostasis. We already talked about that, maintaining homeostasis, and we need energy in order to maintain homeostasis, in order to stay alive. So homeostasis, by definition, biological balance, maintaining a constant internal environment despite fluctuations. So she just looks like she had a great workout there. Her muscles are going to generate heat, and we're going to talk about the laws of thermodynamics. She's not able to transfer all the energy into contracting her muscles, so she's going to have some energy that is generated as heat, and so that's going to heat up her body. How does she cool herself off? Right, she's going to sweat. She's going to dilate some capillaries and get the blood cooling, right? By you kind of get flushed, you get red, and that helps you to maintain homeostasis. Now, if she walked outside right now and it was snowing outside of wherever she did her workout, then her body would, in order to maintain homeostasis, try to conserve that energy. She would stop sweating. Her blood vessels would constrict in order to conserve that energy. Okay, so that's about maintaining homeostasis. All right, 2 big ideas down. Now, here we are on our third big idea, which is all about information. So information runs the world and information runs your body. And so in this big idea, and again, I'm just painting this with broad strokes. In this big idea, we're going to talk about how we store information and how we transfer it. So we store it, yes, in our genes. How we transfer it, we could build a protein, we could build a hormone, a neurotransmitter in order to communicate that information. The instructions for our life, the code for our life is in our DNA. And we'll be talking about DNA and RNA and how we go through the process of transcription and translation. So put a pin in that. We'll get to that at a little bit later. Now, when we think about passing our information on, so you can think about in sexual reproduction, you'll have a haploid sperm and you'll have a haploid egg. And we'll talk about that. And they will join to form a diploid zygote. So here's this baby, right? And it has half of its genes coming from its biological mother and half of its genes coming from its biological father. So it has a variety now that's different from either one of its parents. And that's the advantage of sexual reproduction. And we'll be learning about that when we learn about mitosis and meiosis and the differences between those two. Now, there are other ways to reproduce asexually. Asexually, you could think about a plant. If you took a cutting from a plant and like I do a lot with succulents in my backyard. And so if I want to make another whole succulent arrangement, I will just kind of snap off succulents from all over my yard. I let them sit in my garage for a week or two, and then I start rearranging them and they grow to another whole plant. So there was no succulent reproduction that was sexual there. I just took a cutting from them, and that would make a clone of the original parent plant. Well, bacteria do that as well, and it's called binary fission. And so this bacterial cell, it made a copy of its DNA, which I'm going to teach you how to do all of that. And it went from 1 cell to 2 cells through binary fission. Now, bacteria can also reproduce sexually. We'll talk about that when through conjugation, where they will exchange some DNA. They can also get variety in their DNA through transduction. And that's when a virus infects them and brings some bacterial DNA from its previous host. So I know I'm telling you a lot. Deep breath. Okay, but I just want to kind of paint in broad strokes about each of the big ideas. Now, if you look on your notes, underneath the first box on big idea 3, information examples are DNA, and then hormones and neurotransmitters. Those are just a few examples for you. We talked about reproduction and to reproduce, right? Respond to stimuli and reproduce. You grow and develop. And so this organism is going to change over time as it develops. It's going to focus its energy on upward growth. And then we can tap into big idea 2. Go backwards, big idea 2, it's able to harvest, to get energy and change it into a chemical form that it can use to develop. It might then focus on reproduction. So it would change over time as it is developing. So I gave you the definitions for reproduce and development. So how did it know what to do? Well, that was stored in its genes. But sometimes your genes can have a mutation in them, and mutations can lead to variety. Now, chances are when you have a mutation, statistically speaking, it's probably not going to work out well for you because you're so highly evolved, right? So for this penguin to be an albino penguin, it could have trouble with the amount of light it receives, and it could end up causing it to have cancer. A mutation that many of us have, and we'll talk about this in genetics. I have them here. I'll get really close to you. Okay, I have blue eyes. That is a mutation, right? And some of you have blue eyes out there. Now, doesn't work against me. I still survive. I still have 2 sons I was able to reproduce. So it did not prevent me from passing on genes, but some mutations obviously can. And we'll get into that when we get into our genetics unit. So on the basics of genetics, just before we leave this topic, a gene is a unit right here of information, and that can be stored as a chromosome. This DNA is carefully wound on proteins, non-histone proteins, and we'll call nucleosomes when you group them together, and that helps organize it into a chromosome from when cells are doing cell divisions, like mitosis and meiosis. All of your chromosomes collectively are called your genome, all right? And all of that is made up out of DNA. All right, and then you have all those terms in your notes. The next part, we talk about information storage and response is behavior, and that's how we respond to our stimuli. For your definition, I want you to have behavior is coordinated response to environmental stimuli. Coordinated response to environmental stimuli. Now, it could be a response within the cell. It could be within the tissue. It could be in an organism. It could be in a whole population of organisms responding to that stimuli. In this case, here we have an organism, a plant, and it is responding through phototaxis. It's going towards the light. It's growing towards the light. So you can see down here at the bottom, the light was over to the right. So it grew towards that. And then it could see that the light was here. And we'll talk about how plants are able to do that. But that would be considered behavior. All right, this brings us to our last big idea, interactions, right? So we could talk about how one cell interacts with another cell. Again, you can level it up each time into tissues and organ systems. So here, going back to our first big idea, okay, was living things are organized, made of cells. So let's look at all the levels of organization. So the first level here you can see, and I'm going to make myself big just for a minute here so I can show you how I remember this. So we talk about atoms, right? Like hydrogen and oxygen. Atoms can build a molecule. It could be a simple inorganic molecule like water, or it could be a complex organic molecule like glucose. Those molecules combine to form cells. Now, there are 2 types of cells. So a little overview on cells real quick. There are prokaryotic cells and eukaryotic cells. Prokaryotic cells are smaller, like the bacterial cell, and eukaryotic cells are larger. But what really differentiates them is their cellular structures. So eukaryotic cells have membrane enclosed organelles. You have probably heard of some like chloroplasts or mitochondria or endoplasmic reticulum. Those are membrane enclosed organelles. Prokaryotic cells don't have those. They have DNA, but they don't have it enclosed within a nucleus, all right? So we'll talk more differences about prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells a little bit later, but this is why you see organelle in parentheses in my diagram right here, because not all cells have organelles, all right? So started from the bottom now we're here. Atoms, molecules, organelles, cells. I always go like this, cells, because this is where life starts, is at the cell. Atoms build molecules, molecules potentially organelles, then cells. Cells work together to form tissues, so I rub my arm for tissues. I don't know why, because skin, I guess. Tissues. then organs, like our heart, organ systems, like your circulatory system. Then those organ systems work together to form an organism. So that would be you. And then several of the same organism living together, that's called a population. And then populations, like you could have a population of ants or a population of beavers or a population of fir trees or whatever you have there. But when you put all the populations together, that's a community. All right. And then when you bring in the environment to it, that's referring to an ecosystem. So I make it rain. And then where all living things exist, that's the biosphere. So let's put those two together. All right. So let me move my chair here. Okay. So here we go. Nice. Sorry. Okay. Here we go. Living things are organized, made of cells. How are they organized? Atoms, molecules, organelles, cells, tissues, organs, organ systems, organisms, population, community, ecosystem, biosphere. So living things are organized, just like we went over, made of cells. They acquire materials and energy. They maintain homeostasis. They respond to stimuli and reproduce. They grow and develop, and they adapt and die. All right, so I just wanted to link all of that together in one little song thing you could do. All right, I'm going to make myself small again. Here we are. All right, so that's the part that you need to add to your notes underneath big idea 4, interdependent relationships. So you want to have on the organization of life, you want to type those out. All right. And pause the video if you need to do that. So emergent properties, right? What you can do with an organism is different than what you can do with a population. So you can see that here on emergent properties. See, it's like the dolphin emerging out of the water. Each level of organization, right? Atom, molecule, organelle, cell. As you go up in that level of organization, it has new properties when that is working together. And we're back to that interdependent relationships. Okay, so for emergent properties, you want to have each level of organization acquires new properties. And then I gave you some examples in the notes. All right, so let's look at an example of that. I think, yeah, here we go. So one ant can't do much, right? But you put 100,000 ants together, look what they can do. They can become a ant ladder to that plant and whatever they're trying to acquire in that particular situation. So we look a lot, and this goes back to behavior, which was big idea 3, right? So we can kind of always link them together. All right. The next topic, sorry, let me help you with the notes on that part. Cooperation, competition. From chemical reactions in a cell to community structure in a forest. All right, so that's talking about all the cooperation you can have. Okay, so I'm going to stop this video where we're at, and the next video, which will complete this chapter for us, is going to be about science practices and the scientific method. Okay, that's all.